Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We are so excited for another Triangle Talks. Today, we're hosting Craig Laholiere. Craig is an expert gardener, an author, an educator, and the North Carolina Tomato Man. So we are really thrilled to be able to talk to him a bit about getting tips for our spring harvest coming up, some early tips. As well as talking about how gardening can bring wellness to all of our lives. I'm going to bring on Scott, one of our lead volunteers here in the Triangle, and he's going to get us started.
Thank you, Pax. Welcome, everyone. We're so glad that you're able to join us for something that I have enjoyed for a number of years. And our speaker today, Craig Laholiere, has only enriched that feeling for me. So please welcome Craig, the author of Epic Tomatoes and then Growing Vegetables in Straw Bales. He hosts his own website and Instagram site where it just makes you so hungry when you're looking at all these luscious pictures of tomatoes and other vegetables. He's not just Tomato Man. Craig, welcome.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thanks to Pax. And hello, everybody. Greetings from Hendersonville, tucked into the western part of North Carolina. After our 28 years of Raleigh, we figured before we melted or I passed out from constant humidity, we better head west. And here we are at 2,500 feet, just enjoying life and made it through that first weird year of COVID. So thanks again, Scott. It's such a pleasure to reconnect.
Yes, full disclosure here, Craig and I go back 18 or 20 years. We were colleagues at GlaxoSmithKline and had some really great times on projects. And then on top of that, we learned or discovered that we live about a mile apart and in the same area. So we share a lot of background information, which includes gardening. So just as we begin here, how did you become so enthralled or interested in gardening?
You know, there's a couple of ways to answer that. I think the first is that I owe an awful lot to my grandfather, Walter, my mom's father, and my dad, Wilfred. When we lived in Pawtucket, Rhode Island, my grandfather they lived in a tenement, and the landlords let him use this large place of land behind the house. And so he planted a garden, and even when I was 3 or 4 years old, he would walk me through that garden. My dad would take me to a local park and he'd teach me the names of the flowers. So this seed of the love of gardening and of nature and being outdoors was planted when I was very, very, very young. And then it went dormant for decades until I got married in 1980. And I was up at Dartmouth. My wife and I decided we need to start gardening. So we had our first garden in 1981. I've had one every year since. And it has evolved and changed over time. The love of heirloom varieties and growing lots of diversity really started in 1986 when I joined the Seed Savers Exchange. And it's still going, Scott, still going strong.
I grew up on a farm, and most of my gardening really was from my family, my father and mother. But then as we were discussing recently, I did realize that the oldest generation in there was my grandfather. And I remember him every morning and every evening, he would spend a few minutes in the garden hoeing, going through, and he had the cleanest garden that I've ever seen. I mean, there was not a weed in there. So very, very appreciative of that culture. And I wish some of their green thumbs had rubbed off on me, but I seem to struggle more than produce. But and I'm certain that our listeners out there will, have the same concerns. So in North Carolina, we have a couple of different climate zones there. What should people be thinking about now at the beginning of the year to get ready for spring planting and spring harvest?
Sure. Well, first of all, we're right in that time period where the seed catalogs have probably been coming in and stuffing the mailboxes. There may be some plants starting to show up at the local hardware store or the local box store where you're seeing pansies and things like that. So yes, it's, winter hit December 21st, and we're only a little bit of a year after that. But of course, we already start thinking about spring and gardening. There's a few key questions that one should ask if they want to grow something. The first is, are you going to start from seeds, or are you going to start from seedlings? Seeds take longer, so typically you want to start getting your act together a little bit more, maybe looking through those seed catalogs and deciding what you want to grow. And that alone could take us a very long show just to talk about all of the options out there, because truly, as we'll look at some of the pictures that I have in slides, there's never been a better time, a more diverse time, and a more interesting time to grow something.
Now, when you say starting from seeds or starting from seedlings, does that mean that you're planting the seeds and growing them into seedlings, or you're actually putting the seeds in the ground for things like peas or something like that you can start outside at an early time?
Right. I usually use as a guide things that are very, very tiny seeded and take a long time to grow. Also, the types of plants that are very, very frost sensitive. So I will start things like eggplant, peppers, tomatoes, typically 2 months before a plant out date. And the reason I do that is I've found through my years of gardening that it takes about a month to get a planted seed to a size where you want to move it up into the next size container. And then a month from when you're getting that seedling to a point where it's time to plant out. So I'm going to start my own tomato, pepper, eggplant seeds typically the end of February, early March. And then I know that I'm going to be spending some time in my garage transplanting in early April. And then late April to early May, people probably are going to stop by my house and buy some plants, or I may bring them to a local farmer's market. I'll plant them out. Now, the other key thing people want to think about, maybe you live in an apartment or a condo, you don't have the perfect flat yard, but you do have sun. And so if you have sun, you can grow just about anything. And the tools in your tool belt for doing that could be a raised bed. It could be containers. It could be straw bales. So gardening is not limited to those with the perfect yard with the perfect sun. In fact, I would bet in North Carolina, because we have a lot of loblolly pines and poplars, very few people have that ideal spot. And over time, you may lose it. So if you're interested in growing something, hopefully I can share with you some tips today that will help you get the confidence to just grow something great.
But you definitely need the sun. If you don't have the sun, I guess you could do it indoors with grow lights, but that's a whole different arena.
Yeah, and also you can almost, and this is the science that's coming out, I think of titrating the hours of sun to the type of plants you can grow. So if you get 2 or 3 hours of sun, you can grow a cherry tomato, maybe up to a golf ball size. You can grow things like lettuce, the cool crops. If you really want to grow the big 2-pound mortgage lifters and brag and show off, you probably need 8 hours of sun a day. But as we'll get into later, heat and humidity also cause their own problems. So you may be able to grow something, but what you have to do to tend it to grow it well is another story altogether. But yeah, I mean, sunny windowsills, there are actually tomatoes called microdwarfs that grow about, here's my other hand, grow about 6 to 8 inches tall. And if you have a good sunny south-facing window, you could grow little cherry tomatoes in your window. But more often than not, because indoor growing has its own set of issues and challenges, having a partly or mostly sunny deck or patio or driveway or yard is always going to be the best way to go, Scott.
Yeah. I have found that I guess grow bags is what they are called, are useful in that I can move them around to where they need to be, and also move them away from deer, which I would love to understand how you have these beautiful pictures of straw bales out there, and I don't see a fence. I don't see anything out there. That's between deer and squirrels. That's been a challenge. I tried to grow sweet corn for a while, but the squirrels and the raccoons always got to it beforehand.
Yeah. So there's one thing about tomatoes. Anybody who's grown roses or has understood the challenge of roses will understand what it's like to grow tomatoes well, and that every disease, every critter, and every weather irregularity seems to cause consternation of some sort. And let's think about North Carolina for a moment. Our unique combination of heat and humidity, we may have a drought for a week and then we get 8 inches of rain spread over a 3 or 4 day period. These will affect plants in different ways. So a few years ago, after we had lived in Raleigh for about 26 years, I started collecting weather data to think about, am I imagining it, or is it just getting hotter and more humid? And it turns out that the last year I lived in Raleigh, we had 70 days of 90 degrees or above with high humidity. That dictates different types of garden activities to help your tomatoes grow well. In Hendersonville, so we went from an 8, zone 8, horticultural zone, and a horticultural zone defines first and last frost dates, not necessarily degree days, but just first and last frost dates. We were up to an 8 in Raleigh. We moved to Hendersonville last year, and my garden last year was a 7A zone, meaning I had 2 days at 90 degrees, none over 90 degrees, which means the fruit set of my tomatoes was unprecedented from my gardening experience. But we had an 8-day period where it rained every day, and it brought out diseases in my garden that I had never seen before. We had downy mildew, we had late blight. So gardening is for the curious, for those who really love to have the birds as your soundtrack in the beautiful days you're working out there. If you don't mind a little sweat equity, so it's extremely healthy. But it is also for those who don't get discouraged easily and understand that gardening isn't just a season, it becomes a lifetime pursuit where the gardening year really has no beginning or end. You're always doing something to do with gardening, whether it's I'll use the term plus deltas. You're thinking about what went well and what didn't go well, right, why that may have happened, what you may do next year to alleviate that. COVID has created a host of new gardeners all over the country. And so what I want to be ready to do is help those 1-year newbie COVID gardeners become lifetime gardeners by being available to answer some of the basic questions to help them through it. So we live in a fascinating time, and we're making lemonade out of the lemons that COVID threw at us by getting out there and becoming gardeners and spending time outside.
I have found that the growing periods that where you can grow and reap a harvest for things like lettuce and kale and all those things, I need to be acutely aware of that. And you mentioned the heat and everything here in Raleigh. One thing that I have noticed is it's coming earlier as well. I mean, we have 90-degree days in early June for long periods of time. And that's a lot different environment than if it comes in August. So
it is, Scott. And one of the things I really, anybody who has grown their own lettuce and eaten salads with your own lettuce will think that grocery store lettuce really, really doesn't taste very good. And it's not only a flavor thing, it's a texture thing where your own lettuce just melts in your mouth and it's just sweet and succulent. I ended up planting lettuce in our last few years of Raleigh. We had a raised bed out back or containers, and I would plant lettuce seedlings in the fall. And then if we were to get hard freezes, I would just cover them with like a floating row cover, but they would keep alive. The best lettuce we had was February, March, April, May, because you knew that once June hit, it was just going to bolt. And bolting is the term for when lettuce starts getting really tall, it sets up a seed stalk, and then the leaves get tough and bitter. So essentially at that point, one of the trickiest things about salads in Raleigh is how do you get your lettuce and your tomatoes to come in at the same time, right? It's almost virtually impossible, to tell you the truth.
Well, and that's a challenge for gardening of growing anything. It's like, if you do get your zucchinis to grow, they'll come in and you have tons of them. Yeah. And then the summer squash will come in 2 weeks later or something like that. So, yeah, that is a challenge. And that's where I find it's helpful to utilize farmers markets and things like that where you can find that supply of freshly grown vegetables nearby. But that's not something that all communities have access to. So,
yeah, and I've noticed a lot of growers are going to hydroponic grown lettuces, and you go to the market and they'll actually have a whole setup with water flowing through it, and you can buy these beautiful heads of lettuce. The one thing that I would never do is ever carp at what a farmer charges for their produce at the farmer's market, because those of us who garden and have gardened for a long time, I can just imagine, I don't know how farmers would sleep because you've got hailstorms and thunderstorms and droughts. Whatever they charge for whatever they sell is absolutely worth it, because I guarantee you the amount of waste that they have to deal with, it just must be amazing. So yeah, I love farmers markets, and those of us who have gotten our hands dirty trying to grow it really will gain an appreciation for what a specialized activity that is.
I always remember my dad used to say that, what would you do if you won $1 million? And he'd scratch his head and says, well, I just keep on farming until it's gone. So it is a tough business for those people.
Yeah.
And
but people in the Triangle are so lucky, because it's not only the big Raleigh farmers market, but it's the smaller Chapel Hill and Durham and Apex, and they're
Wake
just
Forest,
popping up everywhere like mushrooms, and they're wonderful.
Yeah. So people now, let's get back to what people need to be doing. You said that they need to be planning for what they want to grow. One thing that I would encourage people to do is try a couple things that you've never grown before, bok choy or some kind of different radishes, and you may discover something that's just marvelous and also easy to grow. So
yeah, one of the things, so in Raleigh, because we had severe deer issues, disease issues in our dirt garden, and tree issues, it had been years since we had grown beans, peas, carrots, some of the many crops that I love. We were pretty much growing tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant. Last year, I had my first successful crop of sugar snap peas, shelling peas, carrots, all kinds of greens. I had a raised bed that was elevated off the ground, and it has nice fluffy planting mix in it. And I just direct seeded a rainbow mix of carrot seeds, and they came up, and you watch them grow. And all of a sudden, about 2 months later, you're plucking these perfect, beautiful carrots. So if you have containers or raised beds, you're not dealing with clay and rocks and those elements of the soil that make carrots just kind of start doing all kinds of deviant ways to get around the blockages. You can grow things really, really, really beautifully. So it's a great idea, Scott, is to and if you do try to grow something different and it's your first time, you may find it's a great success, and you may find that crop just does not like your yard, your method of growing it, you have the wrong variety. So never say never. And just the only time gardeners really truly learn is when we screw things up. And then we think about what it is we screwed up, and we do something differently next year. So gardening is actually very iterative. The one thing that gets in the way is you can't control weather. And so you can control only so many variables about a garden. But at the end, you have to just deal with the conditions that you're dealt that year, and then start doing things to try to get you through the difficult patches.
in Raleigh, I found back in the day when we used to travel, there would be periods of time when I was going to be gone a week or something or other, and I always provided supplemental watering, whether by hand or whatnot. And I had to succumb to a drip line system with a timer, because one week we were gone for just 5 days or so, but it was 90 degrees and it just killed everything. So
and one of the big advantages of growing in containers and straw bales is you literally cannot overwater, because anything that the plant doesn't need essentially flows out the bottom. But boy, can you underwater, as you discovered during that period. And we found the same thing when we'd go on vacations. Asking a friend or a neighbor to care for your garden for you is like putting incredible pressure on them, unless they're an extremely experienced gardener, because they don't want you to come back and find things dead. So they'll always either overwater or underwater. And it's just, we have a daughter, Caitlin, when we live near her, she's a really good gardener. So with her, I could just say, we're going away for a week. I'd come back, everything would be kind of perfect. But the green thumb seemed to slip genetically through into my two girls.
that's a great, and that's also, as you mentioned with your grandfather and everything, it is a generational thing that you can at least pass some of the knowledge and passion for. I could not convince my two children growing up to come out and help me in the garden or whatever. They did like some of the things that we harvested from it. But since then, as they've grown into adults, both of them have embraced it and just are enjoying growing things. In fact, my daughter seeds me with new types of things to grow. She gets a seed catalog and says, "Oh, I'm going to send this to Dad to let him try that."
Well, yeah. Well, there's a couple of other things around this topic. One is that gardening in the age of the internet means that you are overwhelmed with the amount of information that you can find. So let's say you want to grow a particular tomato. You can Google the name of it, and you'll find it listed probably 30 or 40 times, but you will find the reviews vary almost invariably. So one of the things to keep in mind also about vegetables or fruits that we grow is that our tastes are very, very individually calibrated and personal. So Scott and I could have a plate of tomatoes in the room, and we could be on camera, we'll sit down and we'll eat them, and I would be willing to bet we will not agree on which ones are sweet, which ones are sour, which ones are intense, which ones we love and which ones we hate, which makes these blanket statements where people say, I'm going to tell you these 10 tomatoes because they're the best I've ever eaten. The key word is "I've," not you.
But I will challenge you on that one for one that you are responsible for.
I know.
Cherokee Purple is one of the best tomatoes, and I don't know. Maybe we can throw up some slides here, and as we do that, you can talk about
Sure.
your finding and naming the Cherokee Purple.
Sure, I will do that. So what I've done for this talk is I've put just a very brief slide. So just this first one, for example, joy in the garden. Gardens really do bring people joy for so many reasons. The fresh air, being with friends or neighbors or family members, walking through the plants and watching progress. So if you're not a gardener or haven't delved into it, give it a try. I think for a lot of people, the joy of gardening helped them get through a very, very difficult last year with COVID. Social distancing when you're next to nothing but plants is a piece of cake. So let's go to the next slide. So this was taken during one of our walks just a few weeks ago when we found out that they often close the parkway up here near where we live. Particularly near the end of the road near the Pisgah Forest. So this was just my wife and I with our dogs running down the parkway, just taking advantage. So this is one of the joys of, we loved Raleigh for 28 years. This is one of the things that help us love here, are being amongst the mountains. And I'm a native New Englander. I met my wife when I was at school in New Hampshire, so we've come back to our roots. Next slide. This is what a typical Raleigh garden for me looked like. And the reason this driveway contained somewhere around 225 pots the year, I believe, is because the other side of the house in this picture is where I hand dug the garden when we moved in 1992. And that is the area that no longer got sufficient sun due to the growth of all of those loblollies and poplars that you see. So we would, this was typically a mix of, say, 150 tomatoes, 20 eggplant, 20 or 30 peppers, and I would pick a ton of produce out of that driveway, 2,000 pounds, which is a lot of canning, a lot of eating, a lot of sharing, and again, a lot of joy. But next slide. This is our backyard in Hendersonville, and it couldn't be any different. It is a 1/4 acre that's flat, and it gets direct sun about 8 hours a day. It is where our septic field lies, so it is not a yard where I can get out my shovel and start digging planting beds. However, containers and straw bales are absolutely perfect. So I'm growing in the area that gets the sun, but I'm growing above the ground. And you'll see in the next slide that this is what it ended like when it became my tomato jungle. So I had 133 tomato plants. That is insane, yes, we'll admit. It was a mixture of tall growing varieties in straw bales, 2 per bale, 12 bales. I had the rest in 5-gallon grow bags. I also had straw bales put together in quartets of 4, into which I direct seeded summer squash and zucchini and beans. And I had the best harvest of zucchini and summer squash and beans that I've probably had in my gardening life. Straw bale gardening really, really works. So one thing before we go on, move this slide, I picked my first tomato July 15th. I picked my last tomato August 25th. So the harvest was super, extremely concentrated. that was partly weather driven, and it was partly my ability to keep up with it. This became too much for me. I just turned 65. I'm in pretty good shape, but spending 4 to 6 hours every day out there in the warmth and heat does take its toll. So next slide. This is the view from the back of the yard. So you can see our little 1960s brick ranch that we brought up there. This was a downsizing move for my wife and I. It forced us to get rid of lots of stuff. And if anybody knows the feng shui principle, we just feel so much less weighed down now with all of this stuff we've been dragging around with us for decades. And we're living life pretty simply out here and just gardening and laying in our hammock and walking.
But you didn't get rid of any seeds, right?
I am weighed down by the mental burden of understanding that at 65 years old, I want to garden until I'm 100, but that's not 150. So these 50 or 100,000 packets of seeds that I've been keeping have to go somewhere. That we'll leave that for a story for another time. Next slide. So this was what our dining room table looked like typically all throughout the peak of the harvest, say from July 25th. Now this is anxiety causing as well, because tomatoes don't last forever. And I pick them at about half ripe, because what I've learned is that if you let tomatoes hang in the vine until they're fully ripe, critters can find them much more easily, and they're much more prone to cracking, because that means a watering or a heavy rainstorm, they fill up with water, the skin's split, and you've got your cracked tomatoes. So as soon as things were about half ripe, I would load them on the table, eat them as fast as I can. We had an issue in Hendersonville due to COVID that canning supplies were virtually impossible to find within a 100-mile radius of our house. So a friend in Utah, a friend in Oregon, and a friend in Michigan were sending us jars, bands, and lids that allowed us to can our excess. I'll tell you, Instagram was great to make friends, because I put out the SOS and bam, things started showing up. The other thing when this happens, I'm a seed saver, so every one of these tomatoes had something written on the shoulder with a Sharpie, a code number, for when I ate them or canned them or baked them or made sauce out of them, so I could do seed saving. The other thing is tomatoes are perishable. And so we were listening for where the fruit flies would show up, or the little leaker, where the little puddle of stinky tomato juice would be underneath. So this was something that we had to manage every day. Next slide. Cherokee purple. So one of the things that Scott mentioned in the intro that I really wanted to get back to is the connection with family, but it doesn't have to be your family. So because I've been intimately involved with heirlooms and seed saving since 1986, many, many, many families have sent me their treasured family heirlooms over the years. What this means is when you grow your garden, it's not just a garden, it's not just tomatoes or peppers or eggplant, but it is a living museum where you can reflect back, and if you know who this person is, you can see them in the plant. I know this person who sent me these seeds. This is the letter that arrived in my house in Pennsylvania. This is where I lived in 1990. A fellow named John D. Green of Sevierville, Tennessee, interestingly, not too far from where I live now. He sent me this letter. He knew that I was someone who cherished heirlooms and collected varieties. And if I found something I'd like, I would find a way to get it out there. So essentially the letter said, here's a purple tomato the Cherokee Indians gave relatives of a friend 100 years ago. I hope you like it. It's a lot of pressure on that. So the first thing my wife and I thought is, let's see if it's truly purple. There was no black tomato, purple tomato, brown tomato back in 1990. So this is the first time we saw something like this. Next thing I said to my wife is, boy, I hope it tastes good. Tasted it. Man, it's really good. Needed a name. So I just maybe kind of inarticulately or uncreatively decided, let's call it Cherokee Purple, and I'll send a sample to my friend Jeff McCormick, who ran Southern Exposure Seed Exchange Seed Company. We'll see what he thinks, because anything that's this wonderful and unique needs to be out there so everybody in the country can get seed from it, to grow it. So Jeff called me back, and he said, you know, Craig, that tomato tastes pretty good. I love the uniqueness of it, but to tell you the truth, it is so ugly because it looks like a bruised leg. No one is ever going to want to grow that tomato because it's so ugly. But I'll tell you what, I'm going to list it in my seed catalog in 1993 with a caveat saying only for the very adventurous, and we'll see what happens. So that was 1993. Here we are in 2021. It just astounds me that I could probably go to any farmer's market in the country, and one of the tomatoes that will be shown there is Cherokee Purple. So if the Cherokee Indians didn't give it to the Greenleaf family, if the Greenleaf family who lived in Rutledge, Tennessee, didn't get to know J.D. Green and share it with him, if he didn't send it to me, because I was the only person he sent this to, if I didn't send it to Jeff McCormick, and if he didn't sell it in his catalog, if you snip any one of those little links, we probably wouldn't have Cherokee Purple. And this type of fragility and relevance to grow resides in pretty much every heirloom we have. So you truly are, and we live in a time where the climate is doing some crazy things. So we don't know what the tomatoes of 20 years from now will need genetically. So one of the reasons it's important to grow these heirloom types that you can save seeds from is to create this wealth of genetic material that will keep us gardening and growing things for hundreds of years coming, no matter what happens with the climate. So anything you want to ask about that, Scott, before?
Well, you might expound on what you said, anything that you can grow that you can save seeds from.
Yeah.
I can save seeds from anything, but
Right.
I just can't get them to grow. Might expand on that, of what the hybrid industry has done to us.
Sure. So right up until about the year 1949, everything you can buy from a seed catalog was designated as open pollinated, meaning it was genetically stable. So seed companies, they may have done a hybrid, but then they would grow it out for years and years and years until it was stable. And so let's take an example like Marglobe or Rutgers. Those are two famous tomatoes for the 20s and 30s. They were stable. You could grow Marglobe, save seeds, and it would be Marglobe. What happened in 1949 is Burpee got this great idea of creating this hybrid called Big Boy, that they sold the hybrid seed. They actually sold the seed that was in the tomato after they made the cross between the two parents. Now, you could grow Big Boy and save seeds from it, but if you grew plants from it, you would get things that look like Mama and Papa and all kinds of things in between, but you would not get Big Boy because the genetics would be all scrambled up. So that changed the whole paradigm of the seed industry, because that means when you ran out of Big Boy seeds, who do you have to go back to? Burpee. It became very profitable for seed companies to sell hybrids, and it became helpful in some degrees as well, because through the plant breeding, they could work in some disease tolerances and disease resistances, meaning they would grow a little bit better in difficult areas. But really, what we have today is, in some catalogs, we have the latest and greatest and fanciest hybrids. In some catalogs, we have nothing but heirlooms and non-hybrid types, open pollinated. So you, as the consumer, have a choice that's almost gargantuan. It's almost incomprehensible. It's like going to the Angus barn and being given the wine list, which looks like a phone book, and saying you're going to have one meal, pick out one bottle of wine amongst these 20,000 bottles we have. It's kind of the same thing today with gardeners. You're going to have a garden, you want to plant a half a dozen varieties. How do you even hope to choose? So those like me who want to save and share seeds with friends and family will always stick to open pollinated types, heirloom types. That is where you're going to find the most color, the most diversity, in most cases, the most flavor, because in a lot of cases, the hybrid types may grow really well and yield really heavily, but the plant breeders haven't always thought that flavor is the most important thing to breed into the particular type. Does that work, Scott?
Yes. Thank you for that. And maybe a little bit about when you say save seeds.
Yeah.
How do you go about doing that?
So saving seeds can be as simple as squirting some seeds of tomato on some newspaper or paper toweling, letting it dry for a couple of weeks, and then putting it in an envelope and storing it somewhere. What you get are seeds that will grow the next year. But if you want to share them with friends and neighbors, they don't peel off newspaper or paper toweling very well. And if you wanted to save seeds from 2 or 3 tomatoes from that, you get a real mess trying to get a couple of hundred seeds all smushed onto paper. What I like to do is it's very simple. It's a fermentation technique. So here's something fun to think about. You know that seeds germinate in moisture. Tomatoes are 92% water. You know that when you cut open tomato, it's just liquid and pulp. It's very moist. Why, when you cut open a tomato, don't you see tomato plants all growing out of it? And it's because Mother Nature has done this miraculous thing. Each seed is coated with a germination inhibitor. That is covered by the slippery gel sac that makes it almost impossible to pick up tomato seeds once they squirt somewhere. So that works great. And ordinarily, a tomato will last long enough and be eaten by the time that gel would break down from rotting. So with seed saving, what you want to do is essentially make those seeds rot. You cut your tomato open, edible condition tomato, get a cup and label it with a variety. Just squeeze in all of the goop and the pulp and the seeds, and you'll get maybe an inch or two. If it's too stiff, you can add a little bit of water so that it swirls. Then it takes about maybe 2 or 3 days. I like to put them outdoors on a warm day, put a paper towel over them, because it is one of the worst smells known to human beings, is fermenting tomato pulp. What you're doing is the fermentation is breaking down the gel, meaning now that tomato is floating freely in a liquid. That germination inhibitor is washed off the surface. So if you let this go too long, you will indeed end up with a cup of little tomato plants. So I like to let it go 2 or 3 days. It gets a white layer of fungus over it. It's probably killing any diseases that might have been in that tomato plant that are sneaking into the seed. Sometime when my wife is busy quilting or out of the house, so she's not offended by all the terrible smells I'll be bringing in, I add water to the cup and stir it around. All the good seeds sink down to the bottom, and then you just decant off the stuff on the top, which is fermented tomato pulp and a little bit of the fungus and stuff. Repeat that a few times, and you get this clear liquid on the top, the seeds on the bottom. Pour it through a sieve, scrape them onto a paper plate, and then give them about a week just sitting in your dining room. You will have tomato seeds you can crumble up. They'll be nice and dry, and they'll last 14 to 16 years just stored in a coin envelope at room temperature. In back of me, I don't know if you can see it, but I've got hundreds and hundreds of packets of seed that I've saved in the last few years. Now, if you want your tomato seeds to last for 25 years or so, you could refrigerate them. If you want them to last for 50 years or so, you could put them in an airtight vial or a plastic baggie and put them in the freezer. And that's how seed banks keep varieties going for decades and decades, is by freezing the seed. Once you do that, you've now got seeds that are good for, 14, 15 years. This also applies to seeds you buy. So often you'll buy a packet of seeds and it has 30 seeds in it, and you're like, why? I'm only going to plant 2 plants. Well, those are good for 12 or 14 years. So just crinkle up the edge and just store them away somewhere. Make a note that you've got them. And if you like that tomato, you've got plenty to grow or share. Let's go to the next slide and see where we're heading next. So one of the other fun things, I just wanted to show one other variety. I really loved my grandfather, Walter, who got me involved in gardening. And Walter was a cantankerous sort. He was the grandfather that he and I got along, but my other family members thought he was too grumpy, too difficult. He just didn't suffer fools gladly. He didn't like incessant chatter. He wanted to go play in his garden. So once I started collecting dozens and dozens of family heirlooms, I then wanted to go back and started collecting old seed catalogs and seeing what might my grandfather have grown in his gardens. And it turns out the USDA has a database you can search where you can look for names in old seed catalogs, look in the database of the USDA, and then if you see something that people thought were extinct or is not being sold anymore, you can request 50 seeds and they'll send it to you for free. So I found this variety, Salzer's Ferris wheel, sitting in the USDA. I thought it was from the 40s. Got a sample. This is it growing in my driveway 2 years ago. This is what a tomato in 1894 would have looked like. 1 pound, pink, a little bit of cracking, superb flavor. That's what I found out. I collected a catalog that showed that this was an 1894 variety. So my great-grandfathers may have had this in their garden. And then I undertook a project, and I think I relocated somewhere around 100 to 120 tomatoes that people had thought were extinct, but I grabbed them out of the USDA, grew them out, send them to seed companies, and you can grow them again now. So I don't like anything to go extinct. I don't like anything to be totally gone. I like to revive them. Next slide. Anything can be used as a container as long as it has a hole in the bottom for drainage, unless it's one of the special self-watering containers, but that has a design that prevents the plants from getting too much in the way of wet feet. Tomatoes, peppers, eggplant, most plants do not like wet feet. So if you have a container and you have a saucer underneath, let that dry out now and then, because if a tomato's roots are always wet, it will essentially suffocate, and it will look wilted as if it needs water, but it's actually dying from drowning. One of the keys of container gardening is putting good stuff in those pots. So just not going out into the garden and filling it with garden soil, but using a good quality soilless mix. There's lots of different brands you can get at big box stores. And then I mix a little cow manure into that, and things just grow great. One thing I found, that if you like growing bell peppers, the black grow bags absorb heat, and bell peppers will do much better in black containers than they do planted in your garden soil, because peppers and eggplant in particular love hot roots. Those hot roots will make the plants produce like crazy.
And that's one thing that I found in this hot weather. My tomatoes and squash and things like that are not setting.
Right.
But peppers have been just fantastic.
Yes.
And there's such a variety of, there's so many, from hot, sweet, meaty to whatever.
Yeah. And you just said something really important, Scott, that we should have mentioned. Tomatoes do love heat to a point. But once you get over 90 degrees and it's humid, any of the big tomatoes that are about a pound or more, the flowers will open and they'll shrivel up and they'll fall off and no tomato will form. So if you're trying to grow very large tomatoes and you know the weather's going to be hot and humid, go up to the flower a few times a day and just gently flick it or vibrate it with an electric toothbrush. That helps the pollen to move from the anthers onto the tip of the pistil, and that will help that tomato to germinate. Next slide. Straw bale gardening. Straw bale is nothing but a future compost heap. And the key to straw bale gardening is finding a good source, meaning it's organic, or you can guarantee that the wheat that bale was made from hasn't been sprayed with pesticides. I've got some from Lowe's or Home Depot some years ago, and they killed my plant. So you really have to be careful about that. But you buy a bale about 2 weeks from when you want to plant it. And for those 2 weeks, you're giving it heavy doses of nitrogen, watering heavily, and then eventually just a big dose of 10-10-10 or something like that. And you're not adding dirt. You're just creating a crevice in the now softened bale and slipping your plant in, watering it regularly, feeding it regularly, and watching it go. The other alternative is you can put a 2-inch layer of your nice potting medium onto this and direct seed things like squash and cucumbers and beans, and things will just grow great. Anybody who's interested, I wrote an article about straw bale gardening for Gardener Supply, and I can send them the link to that. It's just on the internet if they don't want to find my book at the library or buy my book. Next slide. Wow, we're already at 12:43, so I'm going to do the dwarf tomato breeding project quickly. Why I created this project with my friend in Australia is one of my most frequently asked questions is, what tastes great and is interesting and I can grow it in a container and I don't have to climb a ladder to pick it? So we created this project where we were crossing some of the beautifully colored indeterminate, meaning tall growing heirloom types, with some of the very, very few existing dwarf types. And this slide needs to be updated. We started in 2005. We started releasing varieties in 2010. We now have had over 800 people play with us, and we have 134 varieties in seed catalog. So every tomato you see on this cutting board was grown in a 5-gallon pot in a plant that topped out at 3 or 4 feet tall. Next slide shows, I think, what the plants look like. They're beautiful, they're dense, their foliage is like a dark bluish green, and as Scott will tell you, they can be really unhappy in humid weather. What I've started doing is pruning some of the foliage out to open the plant up a little bit and making sure that I space them very well. Because once you get some of the common foliage diseases like early blight and septoria going, it can spread plant to plant to plant. So these are very promising. There's lots of them. They're delicious. We're learning about which ones do well where throughout the country. And so they're just in their infancy in terms of us learning about them. But the Victory Seed Company sells seeds of all 134. Next slide. And just a couple of slides just to show, if you were a gardener in 1840, seed catalogs carried one tomato and it was red. We thought they were poisonous in the United States back in the mid-1800s. Now, if you're a Seed Savers Exchange member, you can choose up to 12,000 different varieties. The colors, it's just so much fun in the summertime to cut tomatoes and eat the different colors. Next slide shows, I think, one of the famous, this is what my wife and I like to do lunchtime all summer long, is just take 3 or 4, cut them, eat them together, and decide which ones we think are sweet, sour, tart, full, bland, fruity. And that way we understand each other's palates a little bit. But man, it's good eating. And if you want, you can throw mozzarella cheese and Parmesan and olive oil, salt, pepper, make a caprese out of it. Next slide. These are my 2 books. They're sold online. You can get signed copies from me through email, or if you want to buy it at Amazon, I've got plates that I can sign and send to you. They were fun to write. The Epic Tomatoes was relieving to write because I had all of this stuff building up in me for decades. And Story published and said, "Would you like to write a book on tomatoes?" I'm like, finally, somebody's asked. So yes, this is my labor of love. Next slide. Walter, the guy who got me gardening on the left, at his 50th wedding anniversary with my grandmother, who was always telling him something he wasn't doing well. She was probably telling him something about his flower that he was wearing. They were both hoots. And that's my dad with me when I was probably somewhere around 1 or 2, and he's showing me, it looks like phlox in a local park. And I think final slide. This is what I would love each one of you to do. So I've helped you maybe think about how to be a better gardener. I would like all of you to go out and grow a gardener. Find a child, find a friend who's never gardened before, and help them to share the joy of it. And this is a picture taken at one of our tomato paloozas where I think it was the kids that had the most fun looking at all of the different tomatoes. And I think the next slide is just my contact information. I have a website, I have a blog of frequently asked questions. I answer all my emails, nctomatoman@email.com. I actually go live on Instagram, probably starting in about a month, going all through the fall for 45 minutes each Friday, just answering any questions that come to people's mind. And I have a newsletter, and I have no idea what's coming next, but I'm sure it will be a book and another book on the dwarf tomato breeding project. But I didn't expect to spend all this time talking about all this stuff, but I hope, Scott, it was helpful, and I'm really happy to take questions. And
I hope the audience enjoyed that. I still have a ton of questions. I mean, we didn't even touch upon peppers and cucumbers and eggplants, which I'm still trying to find ways of enjoying eggplants more in my meals, but they are such a beautiful plant. They're gorgeous, and the lavender colored flowers are just so much fun. So that's the nice thing about gardening. It's not only the fruits that you eat, it's just looking at it and watching it grow and seeing the diversity of the plant.
Yeah. Well, I can help you with eggplant, Scott, because I was an avowed eggplant hater. And then my wife made ratatouille, and then I'm like, this is a little bit better. It's still a little bit of a texture thing. And then I realized you could peel them and slice them thinly and dip them in egg and breadcrumbs and bake them. And then they taste like potato chips. And you can use that for eggplant parmesan. And then one of the greatest recipes I've ever had is pasta alla norma, which is just roasted eggplant, tomatoes, garlic, hot pepper flakes, and basil and Parmesan cheese. And the flavor if you could serve it to a meat lover, an eggplant hater, and they would say this is one of the best things. So I'm happy to share recipes with people.
I'm working on it. I've got some other family members that aren't
Yeah.
quite there yet, but I've actually found them very versatile. And on the pepper side of it,
Yeah.
I like hot things. And
Wow.
I
Yeah.
think I got one from you, a fish pepper.
Yes, fish.
And the diversity that you see in one plant, I mean, variegated leaves, the different colors of the peps, and it was hot.
Yeah, I would call it a supercharged jalapeno type. What's beautiful about fish is the plant is green and white. I mean, literally, the foliage is variegated, and the peppers are green and white, and so it's kind of a delight to the eye. Unfortunately, when it ripens and turns red, all of the stripes go away, but it's an extremely ornamental plant for sure. Yeah. I noticed there's a chat question here about raised beds. So, in terms of the recommended size of raised beds, you have to think about the root systems of certain plants. So you can get away if you want to grow things like lettuce and radishes with probably a 6-inch depth if you want to keep it at things that, you could grow basil in it and different types of flowers like portulaca and such. If you want to go things like peppers, eggplant, carrots for sure, you probably want to get about a foot minimum. It would be good if you could get 1.5 feet. But what you will find if you do raise beds is the biggest cost initially. I mean, if you're buying kind of a nice one from a gardener supply, there's a cost to buying the bed, but it lasts for years. It's the stuff you put in it. But once you get that stuff in it, then you're just augmenting it a little bit each year with compost and such. But one of the reasons I've started tilting more to straw bales from containers is starting absolutely clean every year. Bales are sterile. So if you want to grow some disease-sensitive heirlooms, straw bales are often a good way to get things to grow that won't grow in dirt. And the other thing, at the end of the year, you've got beautiful compost to use, and you're not paying all that outlay for potting mix. So a $5 straw bale is the equivalent of 2 20-gallon containers. And think about how much potting mix you need to buy to fill 2 20-gallon containers. So each one of these methods have strengths and weaknesses, and I would not go into any method that is new to you whole hog. I would go slowly, slowly, slowly. If you want to try the dwarf tomatoes, try a few. If you want to try straw bales, try 1 or 2 containers. Just try a few because you've always got next year. But what you don't want to do is get into the discouragement of going overboard and then saying, man, I put a lot of money and time into this and it was just a disaster. So I like easing people into things.
I think that's good advice on that. And the other thing to keep in mind is just because something did not grow well this year, next year may be different on that. So, usually give it a couple of years to try. And after 3 years, it failed. Okay, cross that one off.
And I think there's another important thing it's kind of a sad thing, but it's just inevitable. Seed saving has become really popular. Seed companies have popped up out of the woodwork. They don't all have the same level of knowledge about what they're selling in the care in which they're labeling it. So let's say somebody tells you Cherokee chocolate is a superb tomato and it comes out big and brown, and you get it from a company and it's a small purple tomato. They've screwed up. The key is, how do you know? I mean, I'm lucky. I've grown 5,000 different varieties since the mid '80s, so I know kind of what they're supposed to look like. But you don't often know if what you're growing is what it's supposed to be. So I would say is if somebody raves about something and you grow it and it's really awful, like Scott said, maybe not 3 strikes and you're up, but definitely change your seed source, Google it, find out what it's supposed to be, and then get it. And I'm always happy to answer that question. I'm growing variety X. It's not doing this. What would you suggest as a source for it?
Two things that I want to mention before we do leave here is that Craig also introduced me to the biggest little tomato I've ever had. Mexico midgets. There's the size of your thumbnail, if that big. They're kind of hard to germinate and they're indeterminate, so they will grow. One plant will grow 30 feet long. I mean, I've had them take over entire beds. But it's the biggest flavor punch
Yeah. Yeah.
that you can have, and usually pretty prolific on things.
Yep. And the other warning about that is because it's so hard to germinate, no seed companies that are selling Mexico Midget are selling the real thing because it doesn't meet germination standards. So I found a way to germinate it. So you can email me and I can send you a small sample. If you're in the Hendersonville, Asheville, Greenville area out here, I have plants. I will have plants in the spring. So just email me about that, or go to Scott's house in the spring and dig up those little volunteers.
Or you can go to my daughter's previous living place in D.C. where she had an outside, and
Yeah.
at least for the next 2 years as I drove by, I saw the plants that grew up. So
Yeah.
The other thing is talked about saving seeds and things. Could you just comment a little bit about seed savers in your involvement with them?
So I wouldn't be doing what I was doing. I wouldn't be here on this talk. There wouldn't be Epic Tomatoes. The Seed Savers Exchange, when it formed in 1975 as a brainchild of Kent and Diane Wheely, we owe everything. All of us who garden today and can grow the diversity of everything owe it all to him, because he started the Seed Savers Exchange at a time where everybody was moving to hybrids and old non-hybrid varieties were being lost to elderly farmers who were dying, mice getting into the seed cellars and eating them up. And it just wasn't commercially viable for companies to sell non-hybrids anymore. The hybrids were taking over. So he started an organization in 1975. He put a newsletter in a Missouri newspaper saying, if you've got rare seeds or interesting seeds, send them to me, and we're going to distribute them to anybody who's interested. And that was 1975, and here we are in 2021, and it has been singly responsible for preserving and bringing to light thousands and thousands and thousands of everything, beans, squash, you name it. So we owe a lot to them. The one interesting thing is to show how maybe unique seed savers are, another way of saying how weird we are. There's never been more than 1,000 active members sharing seeds through the big yearbook that you get. So you could put 1 million people in a room and only maybe 1 or 2 of them are going to catch this bug to the extent that I've caught it. But we keep things going. We prevent things from going extinct, and the Seed Savers is just worth every bit of your attention to check out. They've got a great website. They have a catalog, so it's just seedsaversexchange.com. And I've been their tomato advisor since the early 90s. So I answer questions and things like that. But thanks, Scott, for bringing that up.
And I think that's about our time here. Craig LaHourlier, I want to thank you very much. As always, I enjoy our talks and discussions. And when this COVID travel ban ceases and we can get out safely, you can expect to see some people up there. I'll try some of your home roasted coffee.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that's my other little hobby. Is I've been a coffee roaster since 2007. So yeah, if there's a hobby around, it'll probably stick to me eventually.
Well, I won't call this a hobby, but I'll put out my plea for anyone who would like to become involved with AARP. We have utilized volunteers for all of the work that AARP, most of the work that AARP does. We have a number of fronts, livable communities. There's efforts to look at food sustainability and insecurity, affordable housing, a number of things that we get involved with, walkways or greenways and such. So if you have a desire and would like to participate in that, and it's not just in the Raleigh area, we have 5 regions in the state. Craig, you are in the mountain region. I can put you in touch with our associate state director there. So just go online and search out North Carolina AARP, and the contact information of the people will be there. So and Pax has put in her info there. Pax will set you up. So with that, I'll bring it to a close, and thank you and goodbye.
Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.